Let's jump right in. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are unpacking the hidden machinery that shapes your daily life. It's an invisible architecture, completely designed by a man you've probably never even heard of, but whose fingerprints are literally on almost everything you do.
Let's just think about this simple question for a second. Why did you eat bacon today? Seriously, from your breakfast to the ads popping up on your phone, all the way to your deepest political opinions, what if the choices you truly believe are your own were actually planted in your head decades before you were even born?
Well, meet Edward Bernays. Born in Vienna and living to be 103 years old, this is the guy who essentially invented the modern world. Bernays figured out something massive. He realized that the absolute most powerful force on Earth isn't money, it isn't military strength, it's the ability to make people want things they never even knew they wanted. He famously coined this the engineering of consent.
Section 1. Uncle Freud's Blueprint. The Psychology of the Masses.
So to understand how he pulled this off, we actually have to look at his family tree, because his bloodline is kind of the skeleton key to his whole approach. Bernays was the double nephew of none other than Sigmund Freud. That's some serious intellectual firepower. He took his uncle's theories about unconscious desires and irrational impulses, and then he mixed them up with Gustave Le Bon's work on mob psychology and Wilfred Trotter's primal herd instinct. He basically took these abstract academic ideas and turned them into highly effective, practical weapons of mass persuasion.
Now, during World War I, Bernays actually worked on mass propaganda for the US government. But after the war, he realized the word propaganda had left a really sour taste in the public's mouth. So, working right alongside his wife and business partner, Doris Fleischmann, he invented a totally new, completely benign-sounding title for his peacetime practice. He called himself a Council on Public Relations. It sounds super transparent and friendly, right? But in reality, it was just the systematic, scientific manipulation of public opinion for private gain.
And the crazy thing is, he didn't even try to hide it. In his 1928 book, literally titled Propaganda, he wrote totally unapologetically that the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the masses constitutes an invisible government. In his mind, everyday people were just too irrational to govern themselves. So an elite class of opinion makers had to quietly guide public thought from behind the scenes just to prevent total chaos.
Section 2. Manufacturing consumer desire, selling a version of yourself.
Okay, now it gets really interesting when we see how we apply these sweeping psychological theories to everyday commerce. Remember that bacon question from earlier? Here's exactly how he did it. The Beechnut Packing Company needed to sell more bacon because Americans were eating lighter breakfasts. Bernays didn't just run a typical ad. No, he engineered a whole public health narrative. He had a doctor survey 5,000 physicians nationwide just to confirm that a hearty breakfast was healthier. Then he published the headlines. He never even mentioned Beechnut by name. He just used authority and social proof, and boom, bacon sales soared.
But honestly, bacon was just a warm-up. By the late 1920s, the American Tobacco Company handed him a massive problem. How do you get women to smoke in public? You have to remember, at the time, there was a deep, legally enforced social taboo that prevented half the population from smoking outdoors. If the company could somehow break that taboo, they'd literally double their market overnight.
Bernays learned from psychoanalysts that cigarettes were heavily viewed as symbols of masculine dominance, so he decided to completely flip the script. At the 1929 Easter Parade in New York, he secretly orchestrated a fake feminist protest. He had young women deliberately light up Lucky Strikes, branding these cigarettes to the press as torches of freedom. He took the very real, very powerful desire for women's independence and attached it directly to a cigarette. And this just brilliantly illustrates the power of his methods. Following that highly publicized, completely manufactured stunt, female cigarette consumption jumped from roughly 5% to 12% in just a few short years. By turning smoking into a public statement of identity, he completely shattered a national taboo.
Once he figured this out, he replicated this success everywhere. For Dixie Cup, he manufactured a massive public fear about catching diseases from reusable cups. To build brand loyalty for Ivory Soap, he created a massive kids' soap carving contest. Get this, he quite literally manipulated the entire global fashion industry to make green the trendy color of 1934, just so women's outfits wouldn't clash with the green Lucky Strike box. He even helped President Calvin Coolidge soften his stiff image by hosting a celebrity pancake breakfast. It's wild. So the absolutely crucial point here is that this was a fundamental shift. Before Bernays, advertising assumed we were rational actors. It was about facts, like buy this car because it goes faster. But after Bernays, it became entirely emotional. He fused psychology with strategy so that corporations were no longer just selling a product, they were selling you an identity.
Section 3. Overthrowing a democracy, the Banana Republic.
Now let's move forward and see how this builds, because things take a much darker turn. His methods didn't stop at breakfast foods and fashion. In the early 1950s, the United Fruit Company, a massive corporation heavily invested in Central America, had a major problem. Guatemala had just established a genuine democracy, and their democratically elected president, Jacobo Arbenz, began a moderate program to redistribute uncultivated land to poor peasants. This directly hit United Fruit, who was offered compensation based on their own famously low declared tax values. Furious, the corporation hired a PR man, Edward Bernays, to handle a sovereign national land dispute.
Bernays didn't use military force. Instead, he used words. He targeted a deep, irrational fear in the American psyche, the fear of communism. By methodically branding President Arbenz as a Soviet threat, feeding anonymous reports to Congress, and hosting carefully guided press tours in Guatemala for U.S. journalists, he basically created an international crisis out of thin air.
If we look at the timeline, it is staggering. Over just a few short years, this corporate PR campaign built the perfect narrative justification for the CIA to step in. It culminated in Operation PB Success, a psychological warfare operation that successfully pressured the democratically elected President Arbenz to resign in June 1954.
And the human cost of this PR campaign? Absolutely staggering. Following the coup, Guatemala was plunged into a brutal authoritarian rule and a 36-year civil war. An estimated 200,000 lives were lost, the vast majority being indigenous Guatemalans, all initiated to protect the financial interests of a fruit company.
You know, years earlier, Bernays had actually learned that the Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels was actively using his book to target Jewish people in Germany. Bernays, who was Jewish himself, reacted with this incredibly chilling clinical observation. He simply wrote that any human activity can be used for social purposes or misused for antisocial ones. He fundamentally viewed his tools as morally neutral, just instruments to be judged entirely by the intent of whoever is wielding them.
Section 4. The Modern Manipulation Machine, the Invisible Architecture.
Which brings us to arguably the most unsettling part of this explainer. Edward Bernays' legacy isn't safely locked away in the past. It is literally the operating system of our present. That torch is a freedom parade? That was astroturfing, faking a grassroots movement. The doctors recommending bacon? Manufactured consensus. Whether it's influencers doing native advertising or social media algorithms explicitly designed to provoke emotional reactions instead of rational thought, every single tool of modern persuasion flows directly downstream from his original playbook.
But here's what Bernays probably didn't anticipate: the democratization of his elite craft. Back in his day, the engineering of consent was wielded by highly trained professionals working for governments and massive corporations. Today, anyone with a smartphone can engineer consent. These potent weapons of influence are now right in the hands of startups, teenagers, and automated bot networks alike. The architecture he built is completely invisible, because the absolute best propaganda is the kind you never even notice. It's the kind that feels exactly like your own free will. Edward Bernays didn't just change what we eat for breakfast, he fundamentally changed what we are, reducing citizens to consumers and turning the democratic process itself into just another exercise in branding.
So I'll leave you with this. If human beings are truly as irrational and emotion-driven as Edward Bernays believed, is the engineering of consent a necessary feature to keep our society functioning, or is it the ultimate corruption of our democracy? Next time you make a choice, maybe take a second and ask yourself, who is really making it? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I genuinely hope you walk away seeing the world just a little bit differently today.